chapter 22. Now it came about after these things refers to essentially the loss of his oldest son, that Elohim tested Avraham and said to him, Avraham. And he said, Hineni, here I am, Hineni. Then he said, take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Yitzhak, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a going up offering on one of the mountains which I will tell you. So Avraham got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him and his son Yitzhak, and he split 8 wood for the burnt offering, the going up offering, and set out and went to the place which God had told him. And on the 3rd day, Avraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Then Avraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey, and I and the boy will go over there, and we will worship and return to you. And Avraham took the 8, the wood for the going up offering, and laid it on his son Yitzhak. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Yitzhak spoke to his father Avraham and said, Abi. And he said, here I am, Beni. And he said, look, the fire and the wood, the 8. But where is the lamb for the going up offering? Avraham said, God will yireh for himself the lamb for the going up offering, my son. So the 2 of them walked on together. And then they came to the place of which Elohim had told him, and Avraham built the altar there, arranged the 8, the wood, and bound his son Yitzhak and laid him on the altar on top of the 8. And Avraham reached out with his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the Malik, Yahweh, angel of the Lord, called out to him from heaven and said, Avraham, Avraham. And he said, Hineni. He said, do not reach out your hand against the boy, and do not do anything to him. For now I know that you fear Elohim, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Avraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind, a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. And Avraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a going up offering in the place of his son. And Avraham named that place Yahweh Yireh, as it is said to this day, on the mountain of the Lord it will be Yireh. Verse 15. Then the angel of the Lord, Malik Yahweh, called to Avraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares Yahweh, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son, indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand, which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. And in your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Avraham returned to his young men, and they got up and went together to Be'er Sheva. And Avraham lived in Be'er Sheva. Now it came about after these things that Avraham was told, saying, what's this doing here? So interesting. He was told, saying, behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother, Nahor. Uts, his firstborn, Boots, his brother. Imagine twins, Uts and Boots. Kemuel, the father of Aram. Chesed, Hazo, Pildash, Yidlaf, and Bethuel. And it was Bethuel who fathered Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. And his concubine, Nahor's concubine, whose name was Reumah, also gave birth to Tebah, Gaham, Tahash, and Ma'akah. Okay, so much happening here. Last week, we endured together the traumatic loss of Abraham's oldest son, Ishmael, but then also the divine intervention to rescue that son from death. But in terms of Abraham and his future, his hope for the future, his descendants, his family line, his hopes and dreams, half of it has been cut off because Ishmael is now starting his own line. He is cut off from his father's lineage. So this is trauma. And we've already been trained by the biblical authors, starting in the 3rd page of the Bible, to see exile as an image of death and death as an image of exile. So even if the exile is temporary, it's a type of death. And now we see that to offer something to God is also a kind of death, even if that offering doesn't involve literal death. In circles for thousands of years, among Jewish scholars at least, this whole story that we're discussing tonight is known as the Akedat. The Akedat, and it comes from the word akah in Hebrew, which means binding. And that word, akah, which we refer to as the Akedat because of the verb change, occurs one time in the entire Bible, once, and it's here. So it's kind of a central idea. It is probably not as accurate to think, you can say this, but it's probably not as accurate to think of this as the sacrifice of Yitzhak, but more accurate to think of it as the binding of Yitzhak, and we'll get into that. Verse 22. Let's go verse by verse. Now it came about after these things that Elohim tested Avraham. So years have passed since chapter 21. Yitzhak has gone from a toddler who had just been weaned, 3 years old. Now he's a juvenile, somewhere in his teen years. And this is the first time, now there have been tests that have occurred. If you did the pre-work, you know that testing is already a thing in the Bible. But this is the very first time in the Hebrew Bible that the actual word, nasa, or testing, appears in the entire scriptures. And that's important. The principle of first mention when you're studying the Bible is the first time something is used that is used again, it informs all those other times. So this is like the foundational concept of testing in the scriptures. Humans having to undergo spiritual exams, it's like a thing. It's like a thing in the Bible, in the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew Bible, but also in the New Testament. So why does it say that God tested Avraham? This is very unusual. It happens sometimes, but it's very unusual in the scriptures when you're being told a story and then you're given a spoiler that this is what's actually going on. Usually you just have to go through the story and figure it out. But in this particular case, the Moses team, the authors of this, feel it is very important. They're inspired by the Holy Spirit to inform the reader right away that this is a test. You've been put on notice. And this is their way of letting the reader know that there's no actual risk of Yitzhak being killed here. The reader is not supposed to take that from the story. What the reader is supposed to take from the story are other things. There's some Torah, there's some instruction and wisdom here, and that is off the table. However, what's on the table is to remember that Avraham doesn't know that. You know it now as the reader because you've just been told. But Avraham, in the moment that you're reading about, doesn't know it. So this tension here is supposed to be within the reader's mind. Will Avraham pass this test? Or will he fail this test? Will it be Bethel or Ai? Remember from the beginning, it's where he's dwelling between those two places. And sometimes he passes Bethel. And sometimes, man, it is a train wreck. Ai, what will this one be? So stepping out of the narrative, providing the reader with this information is kind of like the biblical author's way of saying, please don't try this at home. Okay, this is not like a pattern for you to follow. Don't sacrifice your children. There's something else going on here. So this is what God says, Avraham, and he answered, Hineni. So Hineni in Hebrew, which is appropriately translated, here I am, but the literal meaning of this is look here, or behold, or I'm present to be seen. It's a seeing word. So, we are about to encounter the culmination of all these repeated words throughout the Avraham story of seeing and vision and looking and beholding. And this, the trees of Moreh, of vision, and the trees of Mamre, which is a word play on vision. And now this land of Moreh, or Moriah, which is also a play on vision. So all these like numerous over the top looking and seeing and vision words are going to come to a head in this narrative. So Hineni, here I am, or look here. This is the episode that we find out what all these words are really about. Verse 2, then he said, take now your son, your only son, the one you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as an olah offering, going up offering, on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So I just want you to look at this little poetic line here because we're going to compare it to the very beginning of the Abraham story. Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Yitzhak, to the land of Moriah, and also of which I will tell you. Yitzhak was Abraham's remaining son as far as his own lineage is concerned, and as far as his family is concerned. Sarah has instigated a cutting off of his oldest son, which was not by Sarah, which was by means of their own devising, from the family. So he's got one son for the lineage left. He's the treasured elect son, the chosen son of all of Yahweh's promises to him. But I want you to see the parallel, or the partial parallel, to the opening of the Avraham story. Go from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. This is not accidental. This is kind of bookends that are telling us that something is going to happen which is going to who's going to fill full this calling of Avraham in chapter 12. This labored redundancy, your son, why does it have to say it that way? Your son, your only son, the one you love, Yitzhak. I mean, it's a little bit torturous to hear God say it that way. It's strategic, and it's the biblical author's way. The reason, they don't have to say everything that God has ever said. The reason they include these words of Yahweh is the brutal removal of any ambiguity in this. Remember in chapter 12, verse 1, Abraham was asked to cut himself off from his ancestral family, sacrificing his familial past. Now in this verse, he's asked to cut off his descendant family, sacrificing his promised familial future. The past has already been sacrificed, and Yahweh is saying, now sacrifice your future. In the original call, Yahweh tells Avram at the time to go to the land that he will ra'ah him, who will show him. Now he's asked to go to the land of Moriah, seeing. So again, you've got to see what I want to show you. And all this time we've been trying to see things in the Avraham story. We will today. Yahweh doesn't explicitly say in the text to kill Yitzhak. In fact, the word kill is not used here, but to offer him up as an olah, or going up offering. So to be clear, the implicit directive is to kill him, but the biblical authors are careful not to include that word. And that's also for a strategic reason, because he's ultimately not going to be killed. It's kind of like saying this is a test. Verse 3. So Avraham got up early in the morning. Remember last week I told you to put a pin in that phrase? It sounds familiar, doesn't it? What was the other story that Yahweh said that he got up early in the morning? It was the last story with Ishmael, when he had to exile his oldest son. So this get up in the morning repetition is inviting us to compare the last story, which we will later, the last story from chapter 21 to this story, to compare and contrast them. This is how biblical meditation works and biblical wisdom, is you take two similar things that the biblical authors have framed in such a way so that you can hold them next to each other, and you look at the similarities and you look at the differences and you reflect on it, and you talk to your friends about it, and you think about it when you're mowing the lawn, and you're meditating on it day and night. Isn't that cool? I think it's cool. Okay. He saddled his donkey. He took his two young men and his son. He split the wood. Why all these details? As you know, biblical narrative doesn't give us details like this usually. This is another strategy. It happens from time to time. It's fairly rare in biblical narrative, but when it does, it slows the narrative down. It's this literary technique that paces the narrative to force you to not skip ahead. You have to like dive into it. Okay, he took wood. When he split wood, he took these young men. He goes out. He's got his son. You're not supposed to read fast. That's what they're saying. That way you can absorb what's going on here. Now, a lot of commentators, or at least some, have suggested that Avraham was in a hurry to obey and thus the early morning rising. I'm not so sure about that. I would consider, here he is, he's saddling his own donkey where he's got people to do that for him. He's over 100 years old. He's arranging for 2 other men to come. He's splitting his own wood for what's just like a 21-hour walk. I mean, it's like he's got people. He doesn't need to do this. So he's slowed this down. Verse 4. This should be lighting up all kinds of things in your mind from this class. On the 3rd day, Avraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. So, first of all, 3 days from Beersheba to Moriah, which is close to where modern Jerusalem is, it's a leisurely pace. The last scene here that took place in that area was in chapter 14. Remember when the priest of the Most High God, Melchizedek, gave Avraham bread and wine, and then Avraham gave a tenth. So there was an interaction with the priest of the Most High God. 3 days is a major literary motif in Scripture, and it relates to a time of testing. 3 days and testing go hand in hand. And we've already been given this very rare, explicit instruction that this is a test, but now we get the imagery of test in the 3-day explanation here. 3 days is usually how you read in a biblical narrative that a certain thing is a test. But here we have both. We have the 3-day metaphor, and we also, which was 3 days, but this is why they point it out. And then we also have the fact, this is definitely a test. He raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. This whole raise your eyes thing, you remember when this happened with Lot? When Lot, we talked about it in this class, he had a choice of where he's gonna pick. Avraham says, you just look any direction you want, you pick whatever half of the land you want, I'll take the rest, your choice. And he raised his eyes, and what he saw was the fertile Jordan Valley area, which contains Sodom and Gomorrah and these cities of the plain. And it looked like the Garden of Eden to him. So that's what he picked. Well, now Avraham is raising his eyes, and he sees this place from a distance. So to Lot, raising his eyes to see the evil valleys of the plain and how rich they looked, it seemed good to him, or the Hebrew word tov. It seemed good in his eyes, but it resulted in disaster. Now Avraham raises his eyes to see this place that is to him impending, terrible loss. It seems ra, or bad to him. Well, will he trust Yahweh to show him the difference between tov and ra, between good and bad on Yahweh's terms? Or is he just gonna take what seems good in his own eyes on this tree of knowledge of good and bad? Verse 5, then Avraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey, I and the boy will go over there, we will worship and return to you. Okay, this is like, what a verse. People have argued about this verse for so long. And I think the reason that people have argued about this verse is because it's intentionally ambiguous. The biblical authors, it's one of the most ambiguous sentences in the entire Bible. It's designed to stop the reader in your tracks with all these questions that you don't get an answer to. And one of them is, why does Avraham tell the young men to stay put? Is he concerned that they might try to stop him if they go with him? Is this a foreshadowing of the future ascension in the book of Exodus of Moses and Mount Sinai, in which Moses alone went to the top? And why should the donkeys stay behind anyway? Is it because donkeys are unclean in the future sanctuary? Is it because The son has to bear the weight of the eighths of the wood or the tree. I and the boy will go over there. He doesn't say my son here. Is he emotionally detaching himself in some way? These are questions to which the text doesn't provide an answer, but they're questions that we're being invited to ask for meditative purposes. Biblical meditation is reflecting on text. We will worship, or we will shakah. It doesn't say I'm gonna make an offering, but the word shakah is bow down. Is this because he doesn't want to cause questions in the young men's mind about, wait, offering, you don't have an offering. So instead he says, no, we're gonna bow down. So is that why he says that? And then he says, and I'm gonna return to you. This is the big one. What, you mean both are returning? And it is plural here. So is this because Abraham isn't sure whether he's gonna actually go through with it? Is it because he's lying straight up? Is it because he's got confident faith that Yahweh is gonna come through for him? That's how most people like to cope with this. We do not know. The text does not tell us. Anything we insert here is gonna be from our own minds. And it's okay that we don't know, because this is a feature of biblical literature, is to provoke these reflections on it. So the narrative intent seems to be that Abraham doesn't have any idea what's going to happen here. So his instructions to the young men are they're kind of all over the place. So let's see how this works out. Verse 6, Abraham took the eights, or the wood. Remember, eights, the Hebrew word, it can mean, it's the same word that's used for tree, wood, stick, log, basically anything that's like hard wood. So there's wordplay going on with this in tree. Took the wood for the burnt offering, laid it on his son Yitzhak, took in his hand the fire and the knife, so the two of them walked on together. Okay, there's this Jewish midrash from AD 500. I know, my reading isn't real modern. The New York bestseller list, I have no idea what's going on, but I read these old things. But this Bereshit Rabbah in 56 verse 3, it notes that Yitzhak carrying the eights or the wood or the tree on his shoulder is a lot like a condemned man carrying the gibbet or the method of execution. I find that very interesting. And this is the first mention of fire and knife in this particular story. The image is burning into your mind. It's in your heart now. You're, fire for burning the going up offering because the smoke goes up. That's why it's called the going up offering. And the knife I know what the knife does. And this is horrible. What's going through this man's mind? So, and then the two of them walked on together. The two of them walked on together is repeated in this passage. I don't know if you noticed that when we read through it. And when something is repeated, sometimes it's a signal, many times in biblical literature, it's a signal that there's a little chiasm in between. Those are bookends. And so we're invited to look at the chiasm. And so here's the chiasm, which we're gonna discuss a little more fully. But the chiasm begins with Yahweh spoke to Abraham, and here I am, behold, in verse 1. And look down at the other yellow portion in verse 11. The corresponding section of the chiasm is the angel of the Lord called out to Abraham, and he said, here I am, or behold, Hineni. The red, or the section there, verse 2, take your son and offer him. The corresponding similar section in verse 10 is he took the knife to slaughter his son in obedience to that command. The green section, which is number 3, the third step on this little chiasm, is he laid the wood upon Yitzhak. Look down at verse 9, corresponding section, he laid Yitzhak upon the wood. And then these two that we're pointing out now is this walking on together and walking on together. It's like verbatim. Something is in between the walking on together, which is this very surprising center of the chiasm. It's not the climax of the story, that comes at the end. But there's something that we're asked to consider here that we're going to look at shortly. And that is verse 7. Yitzhak spoke to his father Abraham and said, Abi. And he said, Hineni, Beni. This is another Hineni, the central one. And he said, look, another seeing word, look, fire and the eights, but where is the lamb for the olah, or going up offering? Abraham said, Elohim will yireh, which is a form of the word ra'ah. It's a seeing word. This is a seeing word. It's a vision word. He will yireh. We say Jireh in English. For himself, the lamb for the olah offering, my son. So the two of them walked on together. So this whole thing, this Abi, Beni, my father, my son, it's the Team Moses here is deliberately pulling on our heartstrings for a reason. And he says, Hineni, my son. This is the central occurrence of those three Hineni statements, the here I am statements, or I'm present to be seen statements. In the first one, Abraham is present to see through the incomprehensible command of God. In the last one, which we're getting to, Abraham is present to see the salvation of the angel of the Lord. And here in the center, Abraham present to see his boy. Hineni, Beni. And he's like, God will provide for himself the lamb for the going up offering, my son. This word provide, yira, it's the imperfect third person masculine form of the word ra'ah, which we've looked at many, many times already in this story. And the literal meaning of it is God will see to it. It's a play on this. He'll see to it. It's a seeing word. Okay. So since we don't have commas in Hebrew, reading what Abraham is actually saying and means when he says it, it can be read in a couple of different ways. And I believe this is intentional. And maybe even in Abraham's mind, he's not sure which way it's going to go, so he says it ambiguously. You can either say, with an English comma, God will for himself see to the lamb for the offering, my son. Or, just as easily be read in Hebrew, God will for himself see to the lamb for the offering, my son. Either God will see to the offering with the lamb, or the lamb is his son. It can be read either way. All right, so why is this the center of the chiasm? And David Foreman writes in his Genesis work, he was saying, right now, when I most want to run away, I will not. I am here, my son. Hineni. I know who you are. You are my son. I am your father. I will not evade that hard truth. I will be fully present with you, truthful with you, even when it seems maddeningly impossible. I'm not hiding from you. Now ask your question. And Abraham's greatness was that he didn't run away, not physically, not emotionally. What's going to happen on the top of the mountain? As far as Abraham goes, I have no idea. But whatever happens, I'm your father, and I'm here for you. I can't control who the lamb is. It's up to God. But I can control how I relate to you. I will not distance myself from you. I am present for you in love, always, even now. It's the center. Verse 9. Then they came to the place of which God had told him. And Avraham built the altar there, arranged wood, bound, that's where the word Akedah comes from, bound his son Yitzhak, laid him on the altar on top of the wood, and Avraham reached out with his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. So you hear how the narrative is slowed again, the pacing. You see what they've done here? It's just like all this building and arranging and binding, and it's like the authors are saying, slow, be in this moment with him, feel what he's feeling. And this word for binding, akad, it's the only time, as I mentioned, that this word is used in the Bible. And he reached out his hand and he took the knife to slaughter. So the reader, you and I, thank God, we were told at the beginning that this is just a test. It's only a test. But the narrator is inviting the reader to draw our minds into Abraham's heart, because he doesn't know. His heart, he wants to be there for God, Hineni. He wants to be there for his son, Hineni. And now it's like, what does he do? How can he do? It's totally contradictory, these two things. Trusting God and being faithful to loving him and loving people, it seems like it can't possibly be reconciled in this moment, in this verse. But look what happens, verse 11. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Avraham, Avraham. When you hear something repeated in the Bible, especially in the Hebrew Bible, it's like saying a whole lot. It's a double emphasis. It's like, that's why Holy of Holies, right? And notice that this call comes from heaven. So it's not like the angel of the Lord shows up, appears, then starts talking. This is an urgent intervention. Here I am, Hineni, behold. This is the third instance of this I'm present to be seen, and it's the final one in this particular little story. So interestingly, why is the angel, even if it's the angel of the Lord, speaking instead of Yahweh himself? And I just keep bringing this up because this is where the New Testament authors look back, and even before the New Testament authors, it's like, there's something going on with Yahweh being present in more than one person. Something is up with this. And it doesn't start, post-New Testament in the time of Constantine. The shelf space is there in the very earliest pages of the Bible. I'm just pointing that out. Okay, verse 12. He said, this is the angel speaking, do not reach out your hand against the boy. Do not do anything to him. Oh, I guess I should finish saying about the angel of the Lord. There are scholars who believe that this is an Old Testament appearance of Jesus as the angel of the Lord. That it's not an angel in the normal sense. That this is one of the ways, like another way is Jesus will be referred to as the Word in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible. And one of the other ways is this, sometimes an angel of the Lord who nevertheless speaks as if he is the Lord. So just putting it out there. Verse 12, he said, do not reach out your hand against the boy. Do not do anything to him. For now I know that you fear Elohim, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. See where he did that? So there's a little poem here. Do not reach out your hand against the boy. Do not do anything to him. In the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, poetry is meant to be an emotional interaction with us. That's hard for us. When we read like the Psalms or the book of Isaiah and we see all this Hebrew poetry, you know what my coping strategy is? Let's break it down, right? And I want to categorize, I want to break down every Hebrew word. This is what I want to do. And that's not what poetry is for in the Old Testament or in the New. It is, you can reason it, and it's got amazing things if you break it down, but it's kind of missing out. The real value of it is its emotional punch. And sometimes we lose that. If we ever do like a study on a book of, some of the Psalms or something like that, I'll get more explicit with this. It is a great struggle of mine, but it is for sure, just as narrative and stories in the Hebrew Bible are meant to activate the part of our brains that listen to stories and parables and the imaginative part and so forth, even though it's really stuff that happened. And just like prose, like Paul's letters and so forth, are meant to activate the intellectual, logical parts of our brains, Hebrew poetry is meant to activate the emotional part. It's meant to hit us with our feelings. And this is what it is. He says, for now I know you fear God. So now we're taking the rational approach here. So people have questioned this. It's like, wait, what? How can he suddenly know? Now this is why it must be an angel and not God himself. Or did God not know? Isn't he omniscient? This is not what this is intended to communicate. The Moses team is not saying anything one way or another in this particular passage about God's all-knowing nature. That's not what this phrase is talking about. It's an idiomatic expression that refers to God confirming what he knows. But who's he confirming it with? Is he confirming it with Abraham? Is he confirming it with other angels? It's a way of communicating to the reader. Now, as the reader, as the ancient Israelite first reader of this passage, that now they know Abraham, he really does. After all this nonsense and some good things, he really does fear God. Now, so I know this is challenging because we want to make it a theological argument, but remember how at the beginnings of this class, I invited you to be a good tourist? We're stepping into this ancient culture thousands of miles away and thousands of years ago in the ancient Near East, and there's different ways of saying things. And we have to embrace that. There are similar things that we do now. I think closest analogy I can think of is, I don't know, if you know that, like let's say you invite someone to the house and you just know that they're gonna go into your medicine cabinet. Because it happens every time. And you say to your cousin, we're inviting so-and-so, but they're gonna go into the medicine cabinet. Cousin's like, well, I'm not so sure. They made some changes and everything. And then sure enough, they come to your house, they go into the medicine cabinet. And when they leave, you say to your cousin, well, now we know, don't we? You knew. But now, okay, that's the closest I can think of to what's going on here. Sorry, what a terrible. All right. Then Abraham raised his eyes. Listen, look at the three seeing things right in a row. You see this? He raised his eyes and he looked and behold. So do you think that this little thing that's about to happen here is all about the seeing? This is saying to us, get ready to see, because you're gonna see something right now. Behind was a ram caught in the thicket, this is a bush, by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering in the place of his son. And Abraham named that place Yahweh Yireh, English Jehovah Jireh. Remember, Yireh is a seeing word from Ra'ah. As it is said to this day, these are the Moses team writing this way after Abraham's time. Even to this day, it's said, on the mountain of Yahweh it will be seen to. So what they want the reader to go is like, oh, now I see. That's the response that's being invited. The Lord himself is the one who's going to see. That's what all this seeing language is about. You see, when Abraham was called in the very beginning in chapter 12, and it's like, what? He's got to leave his family, he's got to this land, he doesn't know, he's a stranger. Because the Lord will see to it for him. Abraham's sin with having Ishmael, with Sarah, and that whole lack of trust that took place there. And then, the Lord will see to Ishmael. What about this sin about, throwing Sarah under the bus constantly? Who intervened? Yahweh intervened with Avimelech, with a dream. The Lord himself saw to it. The rescue of lost people in Genesis 14 and 19, the rescue of Lot and his daughters, the rescue of all these people, unworthy people of the valley from the invading kings. Was it really Abraham and his strength? You starting to see? And then who is the sacrifice? Where's the sacrifice coming up that's needed to offer up and resurrect the promise here? Who's gonna see to that? The same one. Yahweh sees to it. Yahweh Yireh. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you. I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. And in your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So this is the test. Abraham, do you love me because of the promises I've given? Or do you love me because of me? And note that Abraham's obedience was willing to lay the promise down. That was the evidence of his faith. Abraham has show me faith. This is what James talks about in the New Testament. And from the heavens, from the skies, we get these, the fullness of these blessings that Yahweh's been talking about, for the past several pages. And the culmination of it, I just want to remind you, this is the thing that gets skipped over. I don't know why, because it's the culmination of the promise. Through your descendants, all the families of the earth are going to be blessed. And why? Because you have Shema, you have listened to me. Get translated obeyed. So Abraham returns to his young men. They got up and went together to Be'er Sheva, and Abraham lived in Be'er Sheva. This is the same place where Abraham lives. It's the same place where Hagar and Ishmael were rescued. It's the place where the conflict last chapter between Abraham and the Gentile neighbors that he had were resolved. It's this place of 7, isn't it? Okay, so this chart we're not going to go over because we don't have time, but this is a comparative reflection on the incidents with Ishmael and the incidents with Yitzhak. This is, like I said at the beginning, this is very intentionally similar in the way that it's worded so that we can hold up these two stories and compare and contrast them. Verse 20, now it came about after these things, and okay, now we name all these relatives. What's this about? Abraham's brother Nahor, he has 12 sons, 8 by his wife Milcah, 4 by his concubine Reumah. So this is what it says is Abraham was told these things. In other words, the relatives that Abraham was asked to leave, now that he wasn't told before, now he's being told, now they are restored to him. You get what's happening here? So now you gotta leave your family, leave your relatives, leave it all behind, go to this new land, and he did. Leave your past, leave all your past connections. And then in this chapter, leave your future hopes and dreams. Leave them. Give them to me. And when he was willing to do that, not only was that restored to him, so was his past family. Dude, I'm sorry, I get excited. But it's also a way for the narrator to introduce Rebecca, and she's gonna feature very prominently in the Abraham narrative in just a couple of weeks. She's gonna be very important. And these are like the seeds to a story that are gonna bear fruit in chapter 24. So first audience, what are they thinking? First of all, they're thinking, well, yes, this ram, male sheep, is a substitute, but what Yahweh requires is an only son. Interesting. And then Abraham, finally, he's passed a huge test, finally. And Yahweh seems to be just as concerned about the proven heart as he is about his plan. And us, how do we reflect? Yahweh, he does see to things, but he prefers to see to things with humans riding shotgun. It's how he rolls. He can do it by himself. He can do the whole thing by himself. He doesn't need humans to do things. But his passion is for humans to ride shotgun. It's what he likes. And how does he provide? Partly by making very strong claims on the faith that we're supposed to show. What Abraham was asked to do, God has actually done. He has given his only son. And it's just interesting that on a hill right outside Jerusalem, it's been seen to. It's been finished. It's been seen to for us. And the New Testament authors obviously see this, not just in this story, but in this pattern through the scriptures. Okay, let's pray.